This oil spill is the worst environmental disaster America has ever faced.
In March 2008, British Petroleum secured the rights to explore the Macondo prospect, just off the coast of Louisiana. In February of next year, they filed their exploration plan. They had everything figured out. The risk of oil spills, worst-case scenarios, as well as statements from multiple independent specialists who claim that the risk of danger to personnel and damage to the borehole equipment and environment is low. They evaluated their environmental impact, how their drilling would affect sea turtles, fisheries, marine mammals, amongst many other things, and they repeatedly stressed one of their major advantages. Due to the distance to shore, about 48 miles, no significant adverse impacts are expected. There's little risk of contact or impact to the coastline and associated environmental resources. The proposed drilling site was located quite far from the coastal waters, which are so important to this region. Almost half of the domestic seafood in the United States is caught here, and these clean waters and coastal cities attract billions of dollars each year in tourism. But don't worry, as BP kept repeating in their report, it is unlikely that an accidental oil spill would occur from the proposed activities. On April 6, the United States Department of the Interior sent their evaluation to BP, saying, "You are hereby notified that the approval of the subject plan has been granted." And so, it started. The Deepwater Horizon oil rig was put in place, but it wasn't cheap. BP paid $500,000 per day to lease the rig, plus contractors' fees. They targeted drilling the well to take 51 days. This would cost them approximately $96 million. But their research estimated that approximately 50 million barrels of oil could be pumped up. At about $80 per barrel in 2010, that would equal a market price of $40 billion. Oil is a good business. So they started drilling. The only problem was that about nothing went according to plan, and they had many delays. Management wanted them to move faster, and they pushed the staff to skip certain safety measures to speed things up. One engineer said that this has been a nightmare well, which has everybody all over the place. The contractor that was cementing the well said about their own work that it was unlikely to be a successful cement job due to formation breakdown. The same contractor warned for a severe gas problem and proposed to install 21 centralizers. A BP official said that it will take 10 hours to install them. "I do not like this." Another official confirmed, "Who cares? It's done. End of story, we'll probably be fine." There was so much time pressure that they even decided to skip the test to see if the cement job was done well. You know, the one that the contractor said he had poorly executed. On April 20th, around 10 p.m., the worst happened.
The Coast Guard is searching in the Gulf of Mexico this morning for survivors from an oil rig explosion and fire. The rig is located 52 miles off the Louisiana coast.
Coast Guard rescuers continued searching the Gulf and kept at it through the night.
It stinks out here, and it's continual. In fact, it gets worse as the day goes on because the sun heats it up and begins some of that evaporative process.
There were 126 people on board that day. Multiple safety instruments failed and allowed for an uncontrollable stream of gas and oil to reach the rig. It quickly caused an explosion, killing 11 people, injuring 17 others. In the following days, the oil was escaping uncontrollably from the well, and bad weather halted the cleanup efforts.
The rig that exploded on Tuesday has now sunk, threatening a major oil spill off the Louisiana coast.
After burning for more than 30 hours, the rig sank around lunchtime today. There are now new concerns about leaking oil and possible damage to the environment.
As the oil continued to leak from the well and the winds and currents were blowing them toward shore, major concerns arose about the environmental consequences.
He's very worried about what happens if that oil spill finds its way into the large estuaries along the Gulf Coast.
We've often used the figure of 90 to 95% of all of the seafood, both commercial and recreational in the Gulf of Mexico, spend part of their life cycle, a necessary part of their life cycle, in the estuary.
One of the chief engineers reported to his supervisor that between 62,000 and 146,000 barrels of oil were leaking each day. But the public heard something else.
The Coast Guard is now saying that it's more likely that 5,000 barrels of oil leaking into the Gulf per day. That's 5 times the original estimation. Is that your estimate as well?
So I think something between 1 and 5,000 barrels a day is a reasonable estimate.
The priorities were to cap the well to keep more oil from leaking into the ocean, and to contain the oil and keep it from reaching the shores. But the relative distance to the coast wasn't as much as a help as they anticipated. On April 25th, the oil was only 50 kilometers from the sensitive Breton National Wildlife Refuge, one of the oldest protected areas in the United States, and an important breeding ground for seabirds and shorebirds. 2 days later, the oil was only 30 kilometers from Louisiana's coast. The response team used floating barriers to contain the oil as well as they could. 1 week after the explosion, almost 100 kilometers of floating barriers were laid out in the oceans.
Within a week, operations began to deploy tens of thousands of feet of boom to keep the oil from coming ashore. Other crews tried to skim up the oil or even burn it before it had a chance to reach the boom.
On April 30th, the first oil washed ashore in Venice, Louisiana. And in the following days, several other affected areas were discovered in a neighboring wildlife sanctuary. On May 6, the oil was found all around the Breton National Wildlife Refuge, just as was feared a few days before. Later, the oil would wash ashore on Dauphin Island, Louisiana's mainland, the Gulf Islands, and Pensacola. The oil was found over 2,000 kilometers of shoreline across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. While all of this oil was spreading, these waters were mostly off-limits to commercial fishermen, on which the region depends so much. The Gulf of Mexico fishing industry lost between $94 million and $1.6 billion due to the oil spill, and thousands of jobs were lost in the first 8 months. On September 19th, BP declared that the well was completely and permanently sealed, but 1 year later, the cleanup efforts were still in full throttle. Hundreds of turtles, birds, and marine mammals were found dead, and multiple national parks were still threatened by the oil. This was not going to be an environmental disaster with merely short-term consequences. BP paid $8.8 billion for environmental restoration projects. They paid $4.5 billion as a criminal penalty, the largest in US history at that time. They paid another $15 billion in cleanup efforts and $20 billion in economic damages to companies and individuals. The total cost for BP was over $60 billion. The Deepwater Horizon catastrophe was the largest marine oil spill in history.
President Obama is getting a first-hand look at the response to the BP Gulf of Mexico oil spill.
Already, this oil spill is the worst environmental disaster America has ever faced.
But I have to disagree with Obama. This catastrophe had the global attention and a mascot that people adore, a pelican drenched in oil and precious ecosystems under threat. All because of greedy businessmen who were getting stupid rich and simply didn't seem to care. This is an event that feels as immediate as it is, and the world collectively screamed, "The polluters have to pay," which usually does not happen. But there also exist much more systematic attacks on the Gulf of Mexico, which hardly receive any attention. The fishing industry in the Gulf of Mexico kills more fish and birds each day than the Deepwater Horizon killed in months. Similarly, the discharge of chemicals by mostly farmers in the Mississippi watershed have created a massive dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, the second largest in the world. The water in this region contains so little oxygen that hardly any wildlife can survive here. These industries are causing significant harm to the same oceans, but are not doing it with giant explosions and shockingly visible examples of pollution. We tend to be more sympathetic to farmers and fishermen than to greedy oil executives. But is that really justified?